Thank you so
This meeting
much.
is being recorded.
Thanks everyone for coming and welcome to the final Girls Berlin Brain Binge. I'm really excited that we have Alex Hall with us today, whose work I've been following for years on Instagram. And Alex will be giving a talk with a very intriguing title, Nature Girls on Native Land, Unsettling Lesbian Horror. Sorry, Unsettling Lesbian Settler Horror. I almost left out the most important word. So I'm extremely excited to hear what Alex has to say on this niche within a niche subject, interrogating representational politics of all kinds. So I'll introduce Alex to you, and then I'll give the floor to Alex. Alex Hall is a writer, dog walker, and PhD student based in Toronto. With a background in cinema studies, her interdisciplinary theoretical research focuses on screen ecologies, horror studies, counter archives, and the burning aesthetics of the queer female body in moving image art. She is also the creator of Leslie Borden, at Leslie_Borden, an Instagram archive dedicated to queer women in horror. I can recommend. Her work has appeared in Soma Technic Monstrum, which I also love, Extra, the collection Recasting the Bygone Witch, and is forthcoming in My Feminism and Visual Culture, and the collections Cinema and Post-Human Bodies, and Weird Sisters, Psychosis, Persecution, and Empowerment in Witch Narratives. All right, take it away, Alex.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to Final Girls Berlin for having me. I've been such a huge fangirl of the festival for years, and it's such a treat and honor to be presenting at this year's Brain Binge. So you just heard, my name is Alex Hall, and the talk that I'll be giving today is titled Nature Girls on Native Land, Unsettling Lesbian Settler Horror. And we will be looking at a small but growing cycle of queer horror films that I've identified as lesbian settler horror. So to get started, here on the right, I've attached a photo that I took of Lake Ontario last summer. And it captures this small little cluster of rocks that always seems to harbor all these rogue plants and flowers, which just seems to be such a wonderful, great example of the disobedience of plants to colonial aesthetics, which is an idea that will be an immersive part of this talk today, and we'll be returning to it throughout. And I've come to kind of think of it as this like guiding light for this ongoing research. But first, I would like to start by situating myself within this work to offer a better context for this ongoing research. So to start, I was born and raised here in Toronto, Ontario, on what is now called Canada, and I consider myself a guest on this land. I also identify as a queer woman and lesbian settler working within queer and feminist horror studies. So as I'm giving you this talk today, I'm probably about 1 kilometer or so away from Lake Ontario. And as a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, this lake was actually considered the most contaminated of the Great Lakes due to its proximity to heavy industrial pollution. But due to ongoing revitalizations of its waterways, it's become somewhat renaturalized to the point that it's now deemed swimmable to live in. So as like self-declared and described swamp hag, living so close to like a swimmable body of water is just like a total dream. But here also I'm reminded of feminist technoscience scholar Michelle Murphy, who argues that, quote, life forged in ongoing chemical violence is also life open to becoming something else, which is not a nostalgic return, but instead the defending of sovereignty starting here, within oneself and each other, here in the damage now. There is no waiting for a better condition. The alter wise of alter life is a non-deferral to the decolonial, seized now despite its impossibility. So I think so much of my relationship to this work is in many ways a response to this experience of alter life, you know, the idea of living in the aftermath of damaged worlds and what that might mean on a more personal micro level. So here, again, I've attached a photo on the right, a photo of me probably 4 or 5, 3 or 4, I'm not too sure, and I'm not too sure the context, but most likely getting into garden mischief. So there's actually another more ghostly entry into this work from a personal perspective. And I think so many of us have this like personal story of arrival to horror. And part of my personal lore is that I've always been a bit haunted by images and stories and histories of displacement. And this is very much kind of manifested in this kind of queer, wayward drive and impulse that really guides my work within horror studies. So as an adoptee who's never had a relationship or known my biological family, which includes a biological father who is French white settler, from what I know, and a biological mother who is Métis and who, as a single mother, moved to Toronto from a small rural community up north, which actually isn't so far from where What Keeps You Alive was filmed. And this is a film that we will be returning to in much more depth later in this conversation. But I think as a result, I've always been a bit haunted by this absent presence. And I always like to describe my work as this like exploration of all the different ways a queer girl can feel haunted. And I think very much this is just like another manifestation of that. So this idea of loss and the unsettled body and all these different points of origin are always kind of somewhere looming in the background of my thinking as I work through this work and just work within horror studies more broadly. So as queer Cree writer Billy Ray Belcourt reminds us in his beautiful essay, A Poltergeist Manifesto, perhaps decolonization needs to be a sort of seance, an attempt to communicate with the dead, a collective rising up from the reserve's necropolis, a feral becoming undead. And I think that this quote really beautifully kind of sums up some of the counter methods that Indigenous filmmakers and artists are using to kind of intervene into these settler narratives that we will be exploring today in this talk in regards to lesbian horror. So this research really began to take form quite a few years ago when I took a grad seminar with Bliss Kwa Lim, who eventually became my MA thesis supervisor. And the title of this, the name of this seminar was Queer Girls and Racial Others. And it put queer girl cinema into conversation with women and feminists of color scholarship. And this entanglement is something that I extend here today through this ongoing research. So for today's talk, I'll be focusing on 2 case studies, including close readings and analysis of Peter Jackson's 1994 true crime drama, Heavenly Creatures, which was filmed and set in Aotearoa, typically called New Zealand, and Colin Minahan's 2018 Canadian horror thriller, What Keeps You Alive, which was filmed and set in Muskoka, Ontario, Canada. So I position both films within a growing cycle of contemporary queer horror films that I'm identifying as lesbian settler horror, which frames white gay women against colonized landscapes, complicating, erasing, and spectralizing indigeneity on screen. And so both Heavenly Creatures and the 2005 queer-coded Appalachian survival horror, The Descent, can both be understood as early iterations of this cycle or proto-films. And other later entries into the cycle include The Green Inferno, the short film Don't Fall from the female-directed anthology XX, Feral, 420 Massacre, What Keeps You Alive, The Retreat, the Fear Street trilogy, In a Violent Nature, and more recently, Influencers and Whistle. So here I also kind of want to note that for the majority, these couples can be considered white lesbians, but there are these exceptions, such as Dina in the Fear Street trilogy, which really kind of add more complexity and kind of extend the discussions that we'll be having today. But for the purpose of this talk, we will be focusing on two white lesbian couples. So one of the earlier films that really starts to take, like one of the first films that really starts to take form within this cycle is the new French extremity film High Tension from 2003, which invokes imagery of cowboys, cornfields, and the American West through a French colonial lens. And I also wanted to note that this film was actually, I think, was the first lesbian horror film I ever remember watching around the time of its release. So I think it's a really interesting and important film for our conversation within the cycle, but then also more broadly and personally through my own kind of exploration within lesbian horror. So all but the Green Inferno present white lesbian settlers occupying spaces deeply connected to Indigenous cultures and history, yet present these landscapes as emptied of visible indigeneity. In this sense, lesbian continuance and hypervisibility get established at the cost of vanishing Native peoples on Native lands. In Heavenly Creatures and What Keeps You Alive, this vanishing is evidenced among their landscapes, markers of primitivism, and the appropriation of Indigenous practices by the film's lesbian settler, a figure that I'm going to be calling the nature dyke. Notably, the way overt lesbianism is constructed in these films is crucial to settler colonial storytelling. So in response to this cinematic erasure, this work is most interested in offering an alternative viewing process that restores forms of indigeneity through the natural world, intervening, disrupting, and pushing back against settler colonial narratives. These are marginalized spaces where more than human agency demands to be seen and recorded and to infiltrate colonial film histories. So what exactly does it mean to start thinking with plants and more than human presence as a way of doing lesbian horror scholarship? So we can attune to the way insects, flowers, trees, weather systems, and bodies of water redirect attention to alternative stories of unsettled ecologies, enlivening a haunting practice that moves against straight patriarchal and colonial forms of cinematic erasure. So despite these films' foreclosure on visible indigeneity, this paper will attempt to locate sites of native return amongst landscapes positioned as primitive ruins. We will begin to think through what it means to reorient attention toward abundant life that's been sidelined on screen as a means of bringing into focus new forms of feminist and queer world making, unsettled within lesbian settler horror's screen ecologies. Or what film scholar Teresa Castro describes as moving beyond human-centered frameworks. So as we begin to orient attention toward the background ecologies and lesbian horror, this talk asks, how do we begin to tend to the precarious act of unsettling marginalized spaces, specters, and beings with care as viewers? So in theorizing further this idea of lesbian settler horror, I draw on Eve Tuck and C. Ree's foundational text, A Glossary of Haunting, where we see the term settler horror first emerge. For them, settler horror describes mainstream American horror film that position the innocent, often white hero as wrongly assaulted by monstering or haunting by the savage other. In these horror narratives, the hero's resolution comes from righting the wrongs of this assault and managing the threat of the other, who has been, as they describe, made killable by settler colonialism. For Ree and Tuck, settler horror, quote, comes about as part of this management of the anxiety, the looming but never arriving guilt, the impossibility of forgiveness, the inescapability of retribution. While haunting, by contrast, is the relentless remembering and reminding that will not be appeased by settler society's assurances of innocence and reconciliation. So both films are part of the Commonwealth, the surrounding landscapes and heavenly creatures in What Keeps You Alive appear vacated of their original inhabitants, the Maori and the Anishinaabe, speaking to histories of mass displacement and forced resettlement. Much of what I'm establishing as the nature dyke trope and her survival in horror relies on her capacity to further occupy native land, using it to her advantage to persist and resist the bury your gaze trope. So in defining the figure within this context, we see an early iteration in Heavenly Creatures where Pauline and Juliet use the natural world as a realm for queer world making. They pervert the white settler imagination through matricidal violence that seeks to preserve this homosocial bond and which aligns them with the historical savage other. We also see it in What Keeps You Alive through both Jackie and Jules' further appropriation of Indigenous practices of survival. For instance, in the film, as well as others within this cycle, the nature dyke invokes the stereotypical white outdoorsy lesbian as an emblem of ecological kinship and unity to the land. Such markers are evident in the film through Jackie's choice of wardrobe, such as hiking gear, ample plaids, athleisure wear, and of course her all-terrain vehicle, which is a Jeep. This referencing is further established through the nature dyke's appropriation and queering of the mythical image of the ecological Indian, as well as histories of lesbian ecofeminist practices of resistance. So here I just want to further conceptualize lesbian settler horror through a lesbian ecofeminist lens, and particularly look at the land dyke movement of the 1970s. So I'm starting here with a quote from Hawk Madrone, which claims that this idea of lesbian landing is through this idea of how we came here to create a lesbian universe. And this was taken from Catherine Kleiner's 2003 dissertation on lesbian land communities. And I also asked for us to keep this quote in mind as we go into our discussion of heavenly creatures. So a bit of context about Hawk Madrone is that after losing her contract with Howard University for speaking up for students at a Black Power rally, she joined the activist group, the Radical Lesbians, which was actually co-founded by Rita Mae Brown, who famously wrote the script for Slumber Party Massacre in the 1980s. Hawk Madrone also co-founded the settlement Flyaway Home in the mountains of Southern Oregon. And as you can see here, I've attached a film still from Barbara Hammer's 1974 short experimental film Dyke Tactics, which along with her earlier films can all be kind of considered really vital artifacts in the documentation of this lesbian landing movement. So the nature dyke, as I'm conceptualizing her, finds roots in the lesbian ecofeminist movement of the 1970s, which prioritized a utopic back to the land approach. And this is a branch of second wave lesbian feminism, also known as the land dyke movement, which saw lesbians in the 1970s and 80s up until about the 1990s adopt a DIY ethos, creating lesbian feminist separatist spaces within rural areas, actively seeking to remove themselves from wider patriarchal society. These spaces, which were also known as women's land, became powerful realms of lesbian autonomy, aiding women to reject notions of private property and the capitalist pressures of urban living. Women would pool resources to purchase land in rural areas as a means to own and steward the land cooperatively. So through a collective belief in sharing the land as and opposing Western settler colonial logics of land ownership, much of the land dyke movement radically reclaimed earth-body relations. Yet in many ways, these communities still reified colonial fantasies that rural land was up for the taking, contributing to facets of lesbian history heavily marked by settler histories. As Catherine Schweighofer puts it, while the land dyke movement, quote, embraced some traditional native modes of relating to land, it did not incorporate solidarity with First Nation political movements or prompt support of contemporary Indigenous communities. For like other forms of playing Indian or going Native, these representations of indigeneity required the absence of Native Americans. So as such, even within lesbian separatist spaces, we can locate histories of racism and colonialism, as well as the formation of gender essentialist turf ideologies and trans exclusionary radical feminism, which is what we saw with the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which ran from 1975 to 2015 and adopted a women-born women policy, essentially barring trans women from native land. The fest sparked years of backlash and boycotts by trans activists in the 1990s through to the 2000s, and saw the emergence of Camp Trans, a counter-festival and protest space held on public land across from Mishfest. So as I argue, the figure of the nature dyke within contemporary horror further draws on this troubled, complicated, intense history of lesbian separatist practices and the occupation of white cis queers on native land. While these movements were initially born out of the need to challenge heteropatriarchal, imperialist, and capitalist structures, the nature dyke in horror soils such anarchistic intentions through the hollow homonormative appropriation of both lesbian ecofeminism's legacy and ancestral indigenous feminisms. So we can see the legacies of colonial power dynamics and tensions within lesbian feminist history return and bubble up in lesbian settler horror. We can also begin to detect its co-option of these movements by male directors working within settler colonial logics of land to be shot and captured and pink-washed, while lacking a deeper understanding of these complicated legacies. These films reveal the more residual and insidious ways this position still happens through queer and lesbian image production by men and straight women. So here we can turn to our first case study, which is of Peter Jackson's Heavenly Creatures, which I absolutely love. So while the lesbian feminist land movement in New Zealand is much less documented due to limited access to these communities, it's no less a vital part of our examination of the film and lesbian settler horror more broadly. Palpably present throughout is the depiction of an Indigenous landscape that thrives around the camera and the girls' queer imaginative modes of play. Because lesbian land is only accessible to women researchers, this absence of scholarly research reveals the systemic issues still at play within academic spheres of queer, Indigenous, and feminist study. But there's a prevalent history of lesbian separatist spaces in and near Christchurch, where the film is set and shot, including a history of lesbian summer camps, which operated from 1975 to about 1991, ending just a few years before the film was made and only a 30-minute drive from where the murder of Honora Parker took place. So what I find so interesting about this film is that it really operates within this sort of fantastical lesbian separatist framework through the girls' insular creative practice of imagining other, better, queerer worlds. In essence, building a lesbian universe that feels feral and primordial in nature. Filmed and set in Christchurch, the film is deeply embedded within the ancestral regions and territories of the Maori, featuring queer white settler girl fantasizing about a wondrous new world and what they called the fourth world, against a haunted landscape of Indigenous displacement. So I know for myself and many queer women who came out in the 90s that Heavenly Creatures is a hugely foundational film. And I also think that it really beautifully sets up these themes, images, legacies, and stakes of the nature dyke occupying Indigenous landscapes in queer horror. And for those that aren't familiar or who haven't seen the film in a while, the film is based on the Parker Hume murder case of Honora Parker by her teenage daughter, Pauline Parker, and Pauline's friend, Juliette Hume, on June 22nd, 1954, which is eerily in just a few days. So the film is considered more of a true crime drama thriller than a straightforward horror, but with Peter Jackson arriving at Heavenly Creatures with a filmography of campy, low-budget splatter movies, I think that these sensibilities are still very much detectable within the screen space. Made 40 years after the crime, Jackson draws on court transcripts, interviews, newspaper archives, and Pauline Parker's own diary entries to recreate the girls' relationship up into the arrest. Notably, the film features the youngest protagonist in the cycle, with Pauline, played by Melanie Lynskey, being only 15, and Juliet, played by Kate Winslet, only being 16 at the time of the murder. These girls used the natural world around them, such as seaside settlements, national forests, hillsides, and gardens, to forge their queer escapist fantasies. They build mythical worlds around, on top of, and inside existing Maori worlds used as backdrops. In one scene, while the girls are away on Easter vacation at the Humes Port Levy summer house, they envision the rugged, sprawling hillsides, valleys, and shoreline morphing into a bright, technicolored fairyland of mystical flowers and giant butterflies and unicorns. Combining the colonial aesthetics of British horticulture, the manicured lawns and flowerscapes of their imagined world, Borovnia, erases, tames, and further colonizes the landscape in real time. The scene exemplifies the sort of troubled vision, the colonial imagination of the colonial imagination that comes to function as a driving force of lesbian settler horror. Using the sacred place of Indigenous rituals and burials by the Red Rocks, the girls project a hyper-feminine otherworldliness onto ancestral lands already containing vast native cosmologies. In later testimony, the girls claimed that it was their proximity to the Red Rocks that led them to find a key to the fourth world. Pauline had actually written in her diary how a queer formation of clouds was the gateway into this other dimension, revealing the land and its weather formations as co-collaborators of this outsider weird girl storytelling. So further, the film's fantasy sequences feel very viscerally, nostalgically, and aesthetically queer in their campy, feminine sensibilities, speaking to the complicated histories of lesbian world-making in the context of ongoing colonialism. This queer quality is indicative of the cinematic language through which the figure of the lesbian continues to be made legible on screen, while simultaneously being haunted by its own co-option of the settler colonial imaginary. As Maureen Malloy notes, the girls' fantasies of femininity are also narratives of nation, speaking to the way lesbian settler horror appeals to a sense of nostalgia for a more innocent time. This idea of loss and memory through the lens of queer cinema is further complicated by our present-day nostalgia as we actively gaze back at these queer film images produced in the early 90s that were themselves referencing an even further queer past. So the film remains historically important in its construction of sexual identity for queer women at the time of its release, as well as in establishing images of national identity through a global cinematic lens. Its playful reconstruction of queer awakenings in the 1950s extends the white lesbian imaginary and its violent histories across generations of spectators, becoming a complicated artifact of lesbian cinema. Through scales of queer spectatorship, there's a sort of cross-pollination effect happening, where effective memories emerge from the countless encounters that we're having with heavenly creatures across timelines and decades. The Indigenous landscapes the girls immerse themselves in become established cartographies of queer feelings, brought to life through our own imaginative practices of nostalgia as viewers. So while Heavenly Creatures has become established in queer film historiography, these dominant processes of archiving lesbian stories also continue to dispossess Indigenous agency and presence on screen, resituating the Maori further out of time and outside of film history. So what exactly can we make of the film's transgressive and joyful queering that seems so reliant on the white femme colonial imagination? As Malloy reminds us, these narratives of national innocence are haunted by disturbing ghosts. A notion of a cultural and queer uncanny arises through the film's strange repetition and doubling, like the dyad of the two girls, their relationship with their mothers, and the fact that the film was shot on the grounds of the former Hume household, as well as the girls' high school and the site of the actual murder on a hiking trail in the Port Hills. Crucially, as both the real Juliet Hume and Pauline Parker were alive when the film was made and released, this doubling extends beyond the screen to the women who are materialized as girls 40 years later through speculative reenactments. Notably, This uncanny doubling effect is also present throughout lesbian settler horror through romantic couplings, creating a feedback loop of lesbian representation. So part of the reason the girls formed such a deep bond so fast was due to their shared experience of childhood illness that left both disabled to various degrees. Pauline developed a bacterial infection in her bone marrow, which required multiple surgeries and led to scarring and a life of chronic pain, while Juliet's experience of tuberculosis as a child led to extensive time in sanitariums and hospitals, as well as during the girls' friendship, resulting in a traumatic period of separation. This shared history of illness and disability led both girls to experience alienation, abandonment, and bullying. As a result, they form a deeply intimate affinity with each other and more than human kin. So as Borovnia begins to expand and inform their queer desires, the girls become more aligned with the outlier figure of the savage other. In essence, Heavenly Creatures rewilds the colonized landscape, replanting it with the animalistic bloom of queer teenage desire. One of the aesthetic impacts of colonialism is the mirroring of a land through the settler gaze and the nostalgia of a more idyllic time. These aesthetics are established and then interrogated in the opening sequences of the film. So here I'm going to play our first clip, first of two, and both clips are the opening sequences of both films. And I think they perfectly set up kind of the ideas and themes that are so prevalent within our discussion of lesbian settler horror. As well, I just wanted to give a bit of a warning for this clip for people that haven't seen it or it's been a while. So we start with archival images of Christchurch, and then we abruptly kind of shift into a scene directly following the murder. So we don't actually see the murder, but there is a lot of blood and there's a lot of screaming girls covered in blood. So just a warning for anyone that might be extra sensitive to those things.
Christchurch, New Zealand's city of the plains. Here, when spring comes to Canterbury, daffodils bloom gay and golden in the woodland of Hagley Park. Through the park, tree-bordered, green-banked, the Avon flows, a small and placid stream. The riverbank is cool and green, a quiet haven from the bustle of the city. Nearby are tall buildings, busy streets, and the heart of the city, Cathedral Square. Every city street is flat, so there are bicycles everywhere. This is a city of cycling. Mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, all on wheels. Cyclists of all ages from 8 to 80 ride to play or work each day. There are thousands of them, and only Copenhagen is said to boast more bicycles. Canterbury University College, weathered grey stone buildings, shadowed cloisters. It was here Lord Rutherford began a great career. The girls' high school stands in Cranmer Square, and not far away are the broad acres of Hagley Park, with playing fields for many sports. In spring, summer, and autumn, Christchurch gardens are gay and colourful. Yes, Christchurch, New Zealand's city of the plains.
So here we have our very first images of the film setting appearing orderly and quite provincial, while the curated footage structures the colonial gaze as a historical marker. As a voice-over narration describes Christchurch as New Zealand's city of the plains, comparing its modern infrastructure to Copenhagen's, we get this expansive sense of Christchurch as both a quiet haven of suburban life and a bustling and modern metropolis cast against a pastoral landscape of mountains and sea. This idyllic view of Christchurch is then violently soured through the image of the threatening woods that invade and corrupt the historical colonial image. The clip illustrates the disorienting and unruly gaze used to introduce the film's less tamed landscapes, framing the city's parkland as other, violent, and threatening. These contrasting tones feel as though Jackson is almost mocking modes of European idealism by placing the queer savage, a teenage girl, as the overarching threat to the colonial project and its nuclear family. The violating presence of the dark, blurry woodlands and the bloodied girls emerging from the Port Hills acts to defamiliarize the dominant colonial gaze, rendering time and space haunted by images of the white violent lesbian. The real-life presence of queer violence within a colonial environment forever unsettles the nation's fabricated image. In essence, this opening scene deconstructs settler memory within the lesbian cinematic archive, further complicated by the film's true crime reenactments, which function as a form of restoring New Zealand's queer history. So as Dallas Rogers puts it, quote, building settler colonial cities on Indigenous lands created the condition within which a set of seemingly hostile natures, which included people and animals within a given territory, were imagined to be hostile to the colonial project and thus needed to be contained or killed, sometimes in mass, for the colonial project to move forward. So as the girls emerge from the dark, thick overgrowth, blood spattered and screaming, the natural world feels similarly complicit in the violence, having acted as a shield for Honora Parker's murder. So from the outset, the film frames the civilized world as under threat by the invasion of the violent queer girl cast within the city's outer rugged and wild bush. So this idea of the hostile nature is further extended through the film's recreation of lost wilderness. Through historical revisioning, a dead white woman is reanimated and reinserted into the living ecologies of location filming. The film's true crime effect conjures the likeness of the dead Mrs. Parker back from the grave, while also framing the surrounding wilderness within a spectral and speculative space that reanimates it 40 years later. In this sense, reenactment appears to repair the past through centering the white female corpse on screen, speaking to the possibilities inherent to film reenactment as a space of unlikely reparation for slain women. Yet the film also inadvertently repairs the surrounding native lands of the Port Hills, furthering Tuck and Ree's theory that haunting is the relentless remembering and reminding that will not be appeased by settler society. This theory actively pushes against any reparative logic of the dead white woman, reminding us of the insurgent qualities of the non-human world. This is indeed a relentless remembering inherent to film reenactment, yet maybe not in the ways that's intended. Here we see the way plant agency mobilizes an archival drive to be preserved through cinematic processes. In redirecting a focus to on-screen plant matter, we can understand the diegetic flora of the film, that is, plant life existing within the world of the film's story, as a sort of collaborator and witness to Honora's murder. While some of the plants and animals in the film are digitally inserted by CGI, the hills, seaside, trees, and animal presence ensure their place in queer film historiography, as they were in 1994. In fact, this type of visually insurgent vegetation can inadvertently correct the way film tends to center settler memory. As Pauline and Juliet tinker with colonial visions as a way to revise land, history, and nation, there's an untampered with plant life that resists this imaginative space, thriving regardless and across damaged lands. While Tuck and Ree remind us it's the settler whose memory becomes history and whose ideology becomes reason, perhaps our practice of thinking with plants mobilizes an oppositional mode of memory making through more than human attunement. But what to make of the intrusive presence of film crews in already precarious environments? On-location filming also means tampering with native ecologies. This means stepping on insects and grasses and the disruption of bio-expansive environments, extending the destructive impact of lesbian settler horror. So I really think that this is best exemplified through the film's climactic murder scene. And in hoping to preserve the relationship from outside influence, the girls decide to kill Pauline's mother while luring her out on a hike in Victoria Park. Crucially, Jackson chose to shoot as close to the real site of the murder as possible. As a result, the girls enact a contamination ritual of the land through the spilling of mother's blood. This also means that stage blood, a common mixture composed of corn syrup and red food coloring, intermingles with soil systems and surrounding micro and macro ecologies. Here we can see how the effects of settler colonialism extend beyond the screen to on-set locations in horror cinema, where the human disturbances of flora and fauna and the ricochet of effects are caught on screen. As Janelle Marie Baker asserts, disturbed soil becomes the perfect place for invasive plant species to colonize, speaking to the layers of environmental impact that bloom in spaces of diegetic screen violence. It's also a good reminder that the eucalyptus trees lining the path are in fact an invasive species brought by the British colonies in the mid-1800s. In this scene, the invasive plant can also be thought of as diasporic in nature, through being uprooted, displaced, and dispersed by acts of ecological imperialism. A so-called immigrant plant, as ecofeminist film scholar Teresa Castro reminds us in her discussion of weeds in film, the eucalyptus trees that line the path where Honora Parker was murdered are also dispossessed flora seeking new life through their lively invasive screen presence. So these forms of ecological imperialism are extended through the material trace and contamination of special effects through location filming and the capitalist networks of material production. The impact of lesbian settler horror is continually extended beyond the screen into non-diegetic worlds, reshaping forests and water systems, trails, and more than human life across transnational filming locations. This environmental impact very much complicates how we view human-plant and human-environmental relations in horror. So as Heavenly Creatures recaptures a landscape of dispossession, removing Maori presence from view, the imperial legacy of spectralizing indigeneity becomes cemented in the archive of lesbian settler horror's origins. Yet by insisting on their materiality, the resistance force of the more than human actively revisions a queer life on screen through the natural world. This film allows us to question how horror's view of national histories align with settler sensibilities and the hidden ruptures that we can detect, revealing alternative histories and lives hidden in plain sight. So now I'd like to turn to our second case study, which is of Colin Minahan's 2018 survival thriller horror, What Keeps You Alive, starring Brittany Allen, which is Callahan's wife, as Jules, and Hannah Anderson as Jackie. So for those that aren't familiar, the film follows married couple Jules and Jackie, who escaped the city to celebrate their first wedding anniversary at a secluded cabin in the woods owned by Jackie's family. Soon after arriving, Jules notices her wife's behavior becoming increasingly strange. Also, huge spoiler alert for this film, if you haven't seen it. So 20 minutes into the film, the film turns violent when Jackie abruptly pushes Jules off the edge of a cliff. Jules miraculously survives the fall, and the film quickly becomes a high-paced survival thriller, weaving through the dense and rocky terrain of northern Ontario. It's eventually revealed that Jackie has killed multiple wives before marrying Jules, acts that perpetuate a cycle of same-sex violence and serial femicide. So the film is shot in Muskoka, Ontario, and the surrounding landscape and what keeps you alive appears visibly emptied of its original inhabitants, the Anishinaabe, speaking to the area's history of mass displacement and forced resettlement and the ongoing project of colonialism through lesbian settler horror. Yet the manifestation of white settler anxieties and suppressed histories of genocide is often detected through other forms of seeing Indigenous life on screen. In lesbian settler horror, what becomes buried and repressed inevitably haunts the now hyper-visible lesbian. In the folk horror documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, directed by Keirla Janice and released in 2021, Ojibwe writer and broadcaster Jesse Wendt reveals a complicated fondness for horror's Indian burial ground trope, claiming, if non-Indigenous people are going to be afraid of the Indian burial ground, then I got news for you. It's all Indian burial ground. So if we reinvoke this statement that all North America is an Indian burial ground, the ruins of Indigeneity and what keeps you alive can be seen gazing back on multiple occasions. Early into the film, it is brought to our attention that the cottage, built by Jackie's great-great-grandfather, is located on free grant land. At the end of the 18th century, through government initiatives, land in Northern Ontario was given away to working class families on the condition that these so-called underdeveloped areas be properly cultivated into agricultural settlements. So I'm going to be playing an excerpt of the opening sequence, and here we'll see how Jackie describes this form of colonial expansion.
I knew you were a fixer-upper, Jules, but this is worse than I could ever have imagined. But it's our song. Since when do we have a song? Turn it down. No. I think I should probably get a say. This is our song, don't you think? No, this is it. This is our song. Good. Mean it.
Oh my God. Jackie, this place is incredible.
Wasn't kidding when I said it was rustic.
Where'd you say the infinity pool was?
Oh yeah, no, that would be the lake.
Love this place more than you.
That wouldn't surprise me.
I mean, I could never, but it's close, like really close.
Okay, you go explore and I'll make dinner.
Yeah, you will.
So my great-great-grandpa, he got super lucky, and after Canada confederated, the government was giving people around here land for free. They promised that they would farm it. And years later, he built this place.
So can we just live here forever?
Have you seen my insulin anywhere?
Check your bag, back pocket. Yes.
So here, through oral retelling of family history, we see Jackie casually reference the Great Lakes Confederacy and free land initiatives. What, of course, is not mentioned is how this regulatory regime enforced government regulation of First Nation communities through practices of displacement and assimilation. These communities were often promised continual access to the land for hunting and fishing, agreements that were, of course, rarely formalized or even honored. Much of what remains unsaid in this scene speaks to Michelle Rahea's description of the violence of invisibility, stating that Native Americans are often hyper-visible in North American films. At the same time, they are rendered invisible through plot lines that reinforce the trope of Indigenous people as vanishing or inconsequential. So vanishing is invoked in this scene mainly through the taxidermied mounts on the wall, referencing the hunting practices Jackie's family likely appropriated from First Nations communities displaced by her family settlement. Further, when confronted with the family heirlooms, Jules's expression of distaste renders these Indigenous sourced practices savage, recommitting indigeneity to a temporal and primitive elsewhere. As such, this disgust reinforces the colonialist motives and logics of assimilation on the land on which the film is both set and shot. However, forms of racialized erasure are further complicated by the distinct foregrounding and hypervisibility of the oft spectralized lesbian. As queer historian Vito Russo notes, the big lie about lesbians and gay men is that we do not exist. So in proposing that she and her wife live here forever, Jules's gesture towards queer preservation also perpetuates colonialist impulses of displacement through queer continuance on native land. It's a threat of ongoing occupation that, ironically, is only really made possible through queer haunting. Here we see the impulse of the white lesbian to become an infinite fixture in the settler colonial imaginary. So moreover, this idea of primitivism through remains is further detected via tank top Jackie wears in the film's final act. Pictured in the slide is an image of a skull donning a traditional Plains Indian headdress. The shirt, notably worn during Jackie's death sequence, reinforces the trope of the wise Indian as a spectral seer or shaman of death through its haunting foretelling. As Maori academic Leonie Pihama argues, images are not separable from the context within which they are positioned, nor are they separable from the relationships that exist within the societal context around them. Here we are reminded of the spectral nature of the Indian within a white appropriation of shamanic indigeneity. In this sense, it's not merely the land Jackie claims ownership of, but a more insidious psychic violence enacted through the intersections of industrial capitalism and white gay identity. The psychic violence corrupts the cultural meaning allocated to the feathered headdress, now co-opted into a commodity of white lesbian culture. An important fact to consider regarding the film's homonormative impulse is that it was initially written as a straight narrative. Director Colin Minahan cast Hannah Anderson after the lead male actor was forced to drop out of the project last minute. As a result, What Keeps You Alive conjures the white lesbian from the margins, rendering her hyper-visible and resilient through her having been written into the script against all odds. Heterosexuality, in this sense, permeates the structuring of the film's lesbianism, framing it within a normative lens of gay assimilation. In interviews, Minahan claims only minor changes were made to the script, and the majority were directed towards the soft butchification of his wife's character, Jules. Constructing the film's gay premise within a framework of heterosexuality speaks to this concept of homonormativity, where homosexuality doubles and mirrors normative facets of acceptability politics. While the normalization of lesbianism is ultimately ruptured through violence, the film establishes the couple within a facade of a white gay domestic status quo. As such, Jackie and Jules's position within a homonormative family unit is regulated and straightened in opposition to the primitive wilderness that they come to occupy. This establishes lesbian continuance and hypervisibility as an opposing force to the film's vanished indigeneity. A further demonstration of the film's appropriative imagery is found in the film's twist, in which Jules is shoved by Jackie off a steep overlook, presumably to her death. As we can interpret this scene as Jules being herded by Jackie through inherited and appropriated hunting skills. By now, the viewer is aware of her ability to live off the land, skills passed down generationally, referencing multiple lineages of Indigenous practices. In this case, it's the buffalo jumps that were practiced by ancestral societies before colonial settlement, in which bison were herded off jumping points to their death. These coordinated and community-driven hunting practices were eventually exploited and appropriated by colonial extraction methods. Cree filmmaker Tasha Hubbard insists that white settlers' inevitable destruction of the buffalo was genocidal in nature, connecting the erasure of Indigenous people and buffalo through violent imperial systems of exploitation. Through Jackie establishing dominance on the land she and her family occupy, the film's white lesbian settler is seen extracting and appropriating indigenous survival tactics to inflict violent spousal homicide. Through troubling allusions to indigenous survival modes, the film exploits native disappearance towards a goal of lesbian endurance and continuance on the land. So while the violence of the sequence is undoubtedly inflicted onto the killable, more masculine lesbian, harm is also enacted onto sacred indigenous practices being appropriated, desecrated, and spectralized through harmful reductions. However, through specific modes of haunting, the subjugated land can be interpreted as enacting subtle forms of resistance against the white nature dyke as colonizer. For instance, what is further interesting to note about this scene is the trace of a desecrated landscape literally biting back. In an interview, Brittany Allen notes that the film was shot at the height of black fly season, hinting at a terrain that ultimately remains untamable. This is captured extra-diegetically through behind-the-scenes footage depicting crew and cast members wearing mosquito netting, and on-screen through audio-visual captures of insects swarming the air. While flies, through their mysterious transformation of fly to worm, to larvae, and back to fly again, could signify the cycle of life or rebirth, one can also associate them with disease and infestation, curses, possessions, and decay in more traditional horror contexts. This returns us back to Tech and Ree's assertion that haunting is the relentless remembering, and what keeps you alive. Relentless remembering breaches the diegetic frame, enlivening an extratextual haunting practice against colonial forms of erasure by the more than human. So in these moments of insectile infiltration, what keeps you alive unintentionally manifests a subtle ode to eco-horror traditions, in which the revenge of nature is a common component. As horror scholar Lee Anderson claims, films such as Jaws, Frogs, The Birds, and Little Shop of Horrors, quote, feature animals historically coded to align an amoral blackness and or indigeneity with an amoral natural element that threatens the stability of human re-white sovereignty. So returning to the film's ongoing presence of flies, we can understand this unwanted or unplanned presence as a potentially mobilizing moment for the spectator to consider the outer reaches of the frame and the non-human world both contained and exiled from view. This form of infestation can be further framed as a vital repossession of diegetic space archived by willful native ecologies. The effect has the potential to defamiliarize and agitate conventional forms of vengeance on screen. So through situating a white lesbian cycle of films within a study centering decolonial film scholarship, this talk has begun excavating queer horror's hallowed grounds. In identifying this new genre and the subsequent emergence of the nature dyke on native land, I have aimed to assert the continuance of white lesbianism in Heavenly Creatures and What Keeps You Alive as a colonizing and appropriative force mobilized to vanish Indigenous presence within the queer cinematic archive. By locating sites of native displacement within these films, a framework is established toward a counter-reading positioning the colonized land dissenting against the white lesbian settler and their external film crews. Thus, if haunting aims to wrong the wrongs, a confrontation that settler horror hopes to evade, as Tuck and Ree argue, perhaps then this is how the land, positioned as ruins, can begin unsettling lesbian settler horror. So that's the end. Thank you so much for being here and sticking around this long.
Thank you so much. My internet cut out in the last like 3 to 5 minutes of your talk, so I missed the big concluding words. What a bummer. But I just got back to see the works cited. Um, Ellie, you're here with me as well. In any case, I mean, this talk gives us so much to dig our teeth into. It's like I don't think I have never particularly considered the framings of these characters in relation to the land in this through this critical lens that you've presented with us today. So I think it's really it's bringing something new, at least for me, to the discourse. And I think everyone here is thankful.
If you have
Thank you.
questions, now's the time. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.
So much to latch onto that I don't even know where to begin. But I was wondering, were there moments or were there scenes in the films that you talk about or others where there are confrontations with Indigenous characters and like that is somehow more fluid? And also if you have examples of maybe lesbian Indigenous eco horror or things like that.
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I had intended initially to discuss the Green Inferno, which is so complicated, and it's the fact that it does very hyper visibilize Indigenous presence. Also, it would have been, I intended to kind of frame it within, the director's complicated status and image. So yeah, I think that that's a very interesting case study too, in regards that apparently like the intention there was to, hire within like the land that they were filming, which I think was on location. But I think that the images of the lesbian within that framework is almost more, I mean, very much more problematic, but in the way that I think it's the inverse, right? Where here, like indigeneity is made visible in ways through the invisible. I think indigeneity in the case of the Green Inferno is made more invisible through the hyper visible, in that case, just through, it's like, complete desecration of through Roth's like lens. Yeah, I think in regards to lesbianism within Indigenous context and authorship, I know rhymes for Old Ghouls is not necessarily horror, I guess, but that's something that I always kind of return to when I'm thinking of this as like a queer actor kind of cast within maybe not an explicitly queer role either, but I think the ambiguity makes it queer by Canadian Indigenous filmmaker Barnaby. But yeah, I think eventually like putting those into conversation together will definitely kind of enrich in kind of the contrast and kind of volatility of the images together. Yeah, it's really a good question.
So that scene that you showed from What Keeps You Alive, this like domestic scene of them in the house, it's such a horror show in itself. Also, like the performance of homonormativity, which we learn, I was at a Q&A where the director just very proudly said that it was written for a man and they just threw a lesbian in there at the last minute, and he thought that was really progressive. And you're watching it just thinking, oh my God, this is like a really despicable depiction of like an extremely heteronormative relationship just being like, yeah, mapped onto these characters. But yeah, especially that scene of talking about the Confederation of Canada and being given free land. You have to wonder if there's any like self-criticism happening from the production team of that. I mean, it's almost too much. I was watching it and thinking this is like over the top in terms of how colonialist it is.
Yeah, I know. I think that there was an awareness, but it was an awareness kind of, like within the same framework as you said, like Colin Minahan's operating within this framework of it being progressive, but through his lens and clearly like, not really super self-aware, I guess, of like that particular legacy. Like I think that they were trying to include a historical framework to set up this like legacy of Jackie with On the Land, but I think that it definitely kind of like definitely reads hollow and definitely reads within like this very normative kind of limited gaze.
Yeah, I
And
also found it deeply unsettling at the time. I was like, this film isn't really for us. This like straight guys
right.
strange appropriation of a queer couple for this. Yeah.
Yeah. And even just framing the house as rustic, like to me, like living in a basement apartment, like that kind of like framing seemed so off. Like it seemed grand to me, like this multi-story house by a lake. And also, yeah, as you noted with the t-shirt, I noticed like when I was rewatching all of the films kind of in close proximity to each other, that the image that I included from Don't Fall of the lesbian couple from that short, Angela Trimber's character is wearing a vintage Florida shirt. And then here we have Jules wearing a very similar shirt. And I'm just like wondering what that parallel or context is, especially with both films being released like within a year of each other, 2017 and 2018. Just continuing kind of that uncanny kind of parallel between films, especially like the ones that were coming out near the end of the 2010s. There was like about 4 or 5 of them that seemed to just be coming out in in a grouping that seemed interesting.
Before I'm about to read a question from the Q&A, but first I also wanted to just thank you for this like note about the effects that filmmaking has on land, actually, like the spilling of fake blood and the way that it affects soil and trails and ecologies and everything. I mean, this is just not a critique that people are exploring that often. So it was really just a like, oh wow, okay. And we're going to that level and to that level. So okay, I'm gonna read this question from Melissa Koroglu. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I have 2 questions. I wonder, how do you distance yourself from essentializing lesbian characters and lesbian romances in horror? Are these case studies more representations or examples of the symbolic characters you mentioned? And then I'll read the next one after, I guess. How do you distance yourself from essentializing lesbian characters and lesbian romances in horror? Are these more representations or examples of the symbolic characters you mentioned? We can also ask for further clarification if...
Yeah, I guess like what do you mean exactly by essentializing? Like kind of figuring them into certain stereotypes? Is that kind of what you were thinking? I think, yeah, like I guess.
Turn on your mic as well, just to say if
If
Melissa,
you
if you
feel
wanted to.
comfortable. Oh yeah, the stereotypes, right? Okay, yeah. I guess like within like framing this idea of the nature dike and trying to like pick out how this could be categorized, how this is being categorized, and with like like I guess maybe you're specifically referencing to like the discussion of like Jackie's kind of outdoorsy dike kind of characteristics. I guess like it's easy to kind of fall into kind of a way of kind of restricting the image in that way. But I think that like, it's more kind of as someone that's like been out for many, many years, I think that like it's more of like a conditioning of like feeling a connection to a culture that like is definitely problematic, but also very much like ingrained in kind of the complexities of like lesbian culture, but then also trying to like scavenge those pieces within cinema and make sense of them I wonder too, like how much of that too is obviously too through Minahan's gaze of like what would a lesbian look like in this film. Um, like the butchification, right, of his wife, who seems a bit out of the part. And once we know the context, seems like it's very much an obvious kind of um, caricature almost. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and something that would definitely kind of like guide my interaction with kind of like and just kind of consciousness, I guess, of like um, the categorization of this character. Yeah.
And the other question that followed that one is, when talking about nature and lesbians or women, girls, female identifying people, how are you not falling into the gender dichotomy of women equals nature versus men equals culture or civilization?
Hmm. Um, I think that like these films themselves are kind of doing that, and I'm just kind of like impacting what the authorial kind of voice is doing to these women in these contexts. And of course, like that positioning is, you know, complicated and complex. And, but I think that there is also like through the discussion of like the land dyke movement that there is very like, tactile and real histories that do kind of inform the queer image in nature. And one aspect that I didn't necessarily get into, but that I had planned to, was obviously like this legacy of the queer pastoral, you know, framing typically like gay men within a very idyllic natural realm, and the lineage and legacy of that within art history. And we see that also more in contemporary cinema too, like with Moonlight and Call Me by Your Name and Brokeback Mountain. I think that's an extension of this, but here I think it's more kind of like a what can be called queer anti-pastoral. So I think that like as I said, like these cis male directors are kind of maybe unintentionally drawing on these like legacies of queers in nature. Um, and I personally don't necessarily like agree with like the essentialization of women equals nature, but I think that these directors kind of um, are kind of enforcing that upon us, and we can note it and see if that expands in any way or can be interrogated in other ways. Yeah. Thank you so much
Oh,
for that question, though. Yeah.
yes, thank you, Melissa. I'm also
Mhm.
wondering about how, if you've looked into any films with more trans representations
Hmm.
in unsettled land.
Yeah. Um, I can't, to be honest, I can't recall any specific instances that like frame trans characters. Oh, I guess there was that terrible film They Them that like was on my list, and that okay, it's Kevin Bacon, and it's I haven't seen it in years, but I think it's like is it a queer camp? And it was a slasher of set in the on binary. Yeah, I think actually that could warrant a bit more examination. And I haven't seen it. I don't know if I even finished it. It wasn't great, but you know, it could still make like a good um, film to kind of put into conversation with the other films. Yeah. So they then maybe. But if anyone else has any other films that could fall under that area of lesbian settler horror or settler horror, queer, gay settler horror, trans. Yeah.
I'm also wondering, like, how about watching films of like white European lesbians or queer couples on in nature, like yeah, like Europeans in Europe versus
Mm,
settlers um, on indigenous land. it's kind of an unformed question, but sort of like if you have any thoughts about the framing, how these framings differ, or how the level of haunting differs, or yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, I guess I immediately just went back to thinking of High Tension, which is an interesting example of that because of its kind of referencing of the American West through the French colonial lens. So it's not necessarily even like really framing it within, I mean, there's of course like a specificity within like the French setting and the French rural. But then there's also this very strange hyper referencing of cornfields and the cowboy and the American West. But when I mentioned this idea of the queer anti-pastoral, it actually is drawing on scholar Cameron Clark's understanding of this concept, and he positions it within the new French extremity, specifically like Calvaire and 29 Palms, which is still European but set in America too. So that is an interesting kind of transnational crossover. But yeah, I think a lot of the new French extremity kind of is very queer and very much, positioned within kind of the natural realm. So I think that would make for a very interesting kind of understanding of the colonial kind of impact within the new French extremity, even just like nichely within that category. Yeah.
Interesting. There's a couple comments showing up in the chat. Tasha Taylor's wondering if Jane Schoenbrun's new film might fit into the discussion. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm so eager to find out, though. I'm just so eager for this film. So, yeah, that just gave me goosebumps. I'm really, excited to kind of see what that brings up for us later this summer. Yeah. If anyone's seen it, yeah.
Don't say anything.
Yeah, no spoilers. No spoilers.
Don't sway our viewing experience. Okay. And then
Yes.
Megan Nelson says The Wild Boys from 2017 is a surreal trans-driven film. I think I've seen this. It's mostly on the sea, right? Aren't they on a boat? Maybe if you can confirm, Megan.
Yes.
I haven't seen it in years. I remember a lot of gender swapping and the landscape being a huge component to that. So yeah, I would
Yes.
wonder how would lesbians or trans folks on water differ from land?
Oh my God.
Funny
Yes.
to
No,
say.
this is a really good example, actually. I haven't seen The Wild Boys either in a really long time, but I love Bertrand Mandico. This one's interesting because it's women playing men. They go from, I think they travel via boat to, I don't know where they're coming and going, but they end up in this very lush island, surrealist space. There's a lot of like bodily fluids. There's so I think it's based around a sexual assault narrative too. But I think that that's a really, really great example. And yeah, I need to rewatch it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a, I mean, Ellie, if you have any questions, feel free. I'm still reflecting on the part about the world building in Heavenly Creatures too, about how you talk about them imagining this fourth world, and then that kind of paralleling like imperialism and conquering and things like that, or at least that was how I understood it. Yeah, and you also talk about the nostalgia or in the fan culture and fan love of that film. So I'm also kind of like, there were so many of these moments where I'm like, that was sacred, but it's actually haunted and cursed, and and
Yeah. Yeah, but I like historically really drawn to like bad gay narratives and complicated gay narratives the most. I think that's like where I'm most like activated or mobilized to do this work and like continue on within horror studies, is just like kind of unpacking. And I think the nostalgia adds so many complex big feelings to these confrontations, rewatching it like many times throughout this work too. New things arise and new feelings arise. And yeah, watching that scene that I shared a still with of the land literally morphing. It was such a fantastical, beautiful, queer kind of world making that always felt so like effective and visceral. But yeah, I mean, kind of, yeah, like the horror and the haunting that you noted, Sarah, is just like another added kind of embodied, visceral kind of tension, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of naively had this, sorry, and then I'll pass it on to you,
Please.
Ellie. I naively had this kind of question that I wanted to ask of like, but how not to? Or so, like how to have this story and not. But then I'm
Mhm.
like, I think it's not the point. Like the point is that always already inflected with this, right? Like you can't, it's not actually something that can or should be escaped from in some sense. Because yeah, I think like to obfuscate it is like dishonest.
Mm.
Uh, but maybe I'm also, yeah, limiting the reach of it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on my very basically worded how not to.
No, I think you're right. Like I think like it's such an important artifact in this like cycle of lesbian cinema, queer cinema of that time for that very reason. Like I think because it reveals so much, it shows so much, and like the further we kind of get from it too, the like larger the haunting kind of feels, and the more that we can kind of reflect as like newer cinema kind of begins to like emerge in between, right? Like I think that it kind of adds like yeah, more of that reckoning that you said. Like I think that becomes even more palpable with time, and is important for that reason, I guess, of what it records and reveals. Yeah.
This is a bit off topic, but since you've done a lot of research on heavenly creatures, I was wondering because it was written by Peter Jackson's wife, right, Anne Perry.
Right.
And I was wondering if you know more about their collaboration, and also just to point out, obviously everyone here probably follows Leslie Borden on Instagram, but you recently also posted about Kate Winslet's relationship during filming, which is really interesting. If you want to like get into that a bit too.
Oh, yeah. No, I actually didn't even know it was co-written and that he had a partner that he was consistently kind of collaborating with until I kind of started researching more in depth, like more recently. So I am very curious about, and it's like an extensive body of work that the two share, how that relationship and collaboration works. But yeah, again, like me not knowing that, but maybe that's just a me thing, seems to be make it an interesting example of like kind of the erasure of that coupling. That, but again, that could have just been like me and my lack of knowledge of Peter Jackson more so. Oh, and yeah, I think that I really wanted to include the kind of extra textual information that I found while researching the the actresses' relationship outside the film. There's been a lot of reflection from both of them over the last few years. I think there was a big anniversary. I can't do the math. I don't know what anniversary, but yeah, both of them were reflecting kind of on how intense their bond was during this. It was a very brief, but obviously very like foundational to both of them coming into filmmaking and cinema through this role being their first time, and forming such a bond. And then Melanie Lynskey kind of noting just recently kind of how they're falling out when Winslet had Titanic come out and the fame that kind of spiraled her kind of out into another world, I guess, as you can kind of describe it, that there was this almost heartbreak on Melanie Lynskey's part, and also Kate Winslet noting how the few kisses that they had, there's like an intimate scene as well, that was one of her earliest kind of romantic intimate experiences, which I think is so interesting and kind of obviously like adds like an extra kind of hyper queer kind of affect to the images that got recorded in this beautiful film. Yeah.
Well, if no one else has any questions, then I would just say thanks so much to Alex
Yeah.
Thank
for
you
this.
so much. This
Great.
was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, extremely
Bye.
illuminating. And as soon as it's up on our YouTube channel, I will watch it because I missed the last 3 minutes.
Okay.
And I can't wait to find out more about how the land fights back.
Okay.
The
Wonderful.
cliffhanger. All
Yeah.
right. Well,
Okay.
please, folks, stick around for the rest of the brain binge. We have one more talk today and four tomorrow. Thanks again, Alex.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye,
Thank you so much.
everyone.